gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakudisa, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our community. And if you're joining us from somewhere outside Treaty 6, I invite you to take a moment to consider the lands on which you're situated as well. So, that being said, I also want to just thank everybody for joining us today. We're planning to talk about EDI and citational justice in scholarly publishing, scholarly journal publishing. Um, let's change my slide here. There we go. This is just a quick breakdown of what we're going to talk about. I have a little bit of intro stuff, but it's all very broad because these topics are huge and we just have half an hour. So just want to kind of set the foundation. And then there's a couple policy examples that we found of how journals have been trying to further EDI and citational justice through policies that they've enabled that I will kind of showcase. And then I'll pass it over to Sarah, who's going to talk a bit about some toolkits and some inclusive approaches, and then hopefully we will have time for questions at the end. So I want to preface this by saying I myself am not a EDI expert in any means, and that I'm really just trying to present some of the trends in this area and some of the things that we've seen happening that could be useful to consider. Um, and that there's just such a broad range of definitions and approaches that we really just can't cover everything today. So, with that caveat, um, and I did also want to provide a definition for citational justice in case this is something that's new to people. This is something that is relatively new to me in recent years. It's something I hadn't heard of before. But essentially, citational justice is the act of choosing to cite authors based on their specific identities, and to do that as a means of uplifting marginalized voices. And that's based on a body of research that's showing that women and BIPOC people are cited less frequently than their white male counterparts. So it's a deliberate decision in citation practices. A couple of things considerations when we're talking about citational justice is that, it's pretty commonly agreed that citations are an ineffective method of proving research value, but they still really are commonly used. And so engaging with different ideas is really what people are trying to accomplish when they're forwarding citational justice initiatives, and just using those practices is just a means to try to encourage that engagement. And then, of course, the motivation behind that is really, you know, if certain perspectives are left out, then, how complete is the research? Is the research replicating bias? These are possibilities that should be considered. So that's my very short background on citational justice. And then I just provided some further readings, some things that I've delved into that I think would be really useful. So if you want to delve further into this, when we share the slides, or if you have the slides now, I recommend taking a look at some of these as places to start to learn more about citational justice and some EDI and scholarly publishing. Okay. So let's start. I want to talk about some examples of what some journals have been doing and some publishers have been doing. So I have two examples of policy statements, and then a sort of initiative on demographic data collection that's uh, getting pretty big and seems like it's going to be launched very soon. So you'll probably be seeing more about it. So I just wanted to bring it to everyone's attention. So the policy statements that I'm going to talk about, they kind of have the journals are taking the same approach, where essentially when a article is submitted, if it's accepted, the journal is then providing some information, a form or a statement or instructions to authors of policy statements that they could then append to the end of their article and would be published in the journal that way. And for all of the ones that I saw, it was optional on the part of the authors whether they wanted to include these statements or not, and that the journal was committing to kind of report annually on the progress or any impact on the whatever metric they're trying to further with the statements that they were reporting on that annually. So I'll show the first example, and that's the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. And so they've encouraged their authors to include this diversity in citation practices statement, is what they're calling it. And essentially, they have a template um, that includes the citation gender balance of their journal, of the works cited in all the articles across, I think, 10 years. And then they encourage the author to include that statement and state the citation balance of the citations included in that paper at the end. And so there's a tool that I've linked here that's this is an acronym, GCBI Elizer. But essentially what it allows you to do is you uh, copy and paste the reference list of an article into this tool, and then it will tell you based on, the algorithm that it's using, the breakdown of the gender balance of the articles that are cited in that list. So what this looks like, here's an example statement here. So you can see this first few sentences are just what's provided by the journal, and it breaks down the gender citation balance. And then the last sentence just includes the breakdown for that article. So this is one example. And so they started this in for the full year of 2021. So they did report on the progress that they saw. It was pretty modest, as you can kind of see from this quote here, and only 24 articles had chose to include the statement, but they did see some marginal reductions in the inequity of the citations. So they were, modestly optimistic at the impact that this had had. So, and it's only 1 year, so it's hard to kind of, extrapolate, but just sharing that. And you can look at the article and more information. I've linked it there. Okay. The next example that I wanted to talk about is another statement, same kind of format where the journal provides some instructions, and then it's optional whether the authors want to append it to their article. And for this example, the journal is Cell Press. And so theirs is not citation based solely, it's actually an inclusion and diversity statement. And so what this journal does is they provide a standardized form that they give to all of the authors at acceptance of submission. And then going through the form, it asks the authors, questions about things like the diversity of research participants, of the authors, as well as the citations. And going through this form that they provide is supposed to give the authors the means to create an inclusion and diversity statement that is uniquely applicable to that research and to that article. So that's the approach that they are taking. So here's an example of one of these statements that one of those articles included. You can see that it talks about, the sex balance of the non-human subjects, uh, the diversity of the authors, and then as well as the citations. So this way it's unique, but it's really encouraging the authors to think about um, the EDI of the research that they're doing and and to present that, as a priority by including that in their author or in their articles. So again, they reported on this after a year, and modest, success. It's really new, but they did have 9% choosing to include the statement. Um, and they were really encouraged by the results and as well as the feedback that they received from authors. And so they have, committed to um, increasing the advocacy for including these statements um, going forward. So that's just another example. Make sure I'm okay on time here. Okay. All right. So I've also included some other statements that other journals have chose to include. There's just so many that we can't include all of them, but I hope to make the point that it's important to consider, you know, for each individual journal, what is important, what is the priority, what makes sense for that journal and that journal's audience to include, and then to go forward with that. Okay, so another sort of initiative movement that I kind of wanted to talk about quickly is regarding demographic data collection. So I'm not sure how familiar people are with this, but a few years ago, there was a joint commitment for action on inclusion and diversity in publishing. And this was spearheaded by the Royal Society for Chemistry. What's really noteworthy about this initiative is that the number of publishers and journals that have signed on is really, really significant. So I think we're going to be seeing a lot of this demographic data collection going forward. So it isn't just the data collection that's part of this commitment. It does include minimum standards for inclusion and diversity in publishing, as well as some other commitments to collecting data and how to use that data and publicly share that data. So you can see more about that from those links. Essentially, these are their 4 commitments that this data collection initiative has been built upon. Is they're really trying to understand the research community, reflect that diversity, use that to make decisions, and set minimum standards for diversity and inclusion in publishing. And one of the big pieces of this is the standardized question for self-reported diversity data collection. And I'm just going to click on this link because I think this really shows better than what I'm saying, the real breadth of this initiative. So you can see it started with just 12 publishers in 2020, but now the steering committee has been launched, and these standardized questions for data collection are going to be starting to be used going forward, I think in the coming months and maybe year. But there is over 15,000 journals that have agreed to be doing this. And you can see these publishers are all of the, large commercial publishers. So I just wanted to point that out that as you submit papers, or you'll be hearing about people submitting papers, all of these things, you'll be seeing a lot more of this. So just something to be aware of and potentially consider whether it makes sense to collect any demographic data for your own publishing. Right? And they will be reporting on this publicly, at least some of the data that they collect. So I think this will be really interesting to watch for some of these larger trends going forward. Okay, that was a little bit of a whirlwind and hopefully not too much information. And I'm going to pass it over to Sarah now to talk a little bit more about some toolkits and approaches.
Yeah, so more coming your way. We realize this is a very large topic for 30 minutes. We're kind of skeptical about our ability to cover this because I think, anyway, so at this point, Katie has done a nice kind of introduction to citational justice. We're looking at how some journals are addressing inclusion with their policy statements. And I intended to bring a few more kind of practical approaches, tools that you can use to sort of increase the equity in your editorial and review processes. And I really hope I don't like muddy the field and make this too confusing here. So this part of the presentation is supposed to be tools, showcasing some tools. Everything I found was called a toolkit. So hence the title here. So we can go to the next slide, Katie. All right, so the first one I kind of wanted to highlight for you was the American Psychological Association's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Toolkit for Journal Editors. And so this is like a wonderful, very comprehensive toolkit that covers some of the things Katie was talking about and more. So writing the diversity statements, increasing the representation, improving the representation of your journal, and looking at reducing research bias and things like that. So yeah, that's right. And inclusive language as well. So it's not only a great toolkit and worth checking out, but one of the nice things is they've got this checklist that sort of summarizes some of the suggestions that they're making in a really practical ways. So when you have the slides, and I'll share it again at the end, but also we will send it out to our list of registrants. You can click on where it says EDI checklist to actually get to the toolkit if you'd like. But right now I'm just going to kind of showcase some of the suggestions that they make that could be like approaches that you might take. So Katie, we can go to, okay. So the first one could be broadening your pool of submissions. And one of the ways you can do this is using collaborative methodologies through an open or invited call for papers. There's another suggestion that you could offer half or quarter time associate editor positions to reduce workload requirements and eliminate some of the barriers that women and Black, Indigenous people of color face when serving in journal leadership roles. You can ask reviewers to provide authors with feedback regarding bias-free language, and that's something I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a second. And you could implement an editorial fellowship program for your journal, focusing specifically on training folks from historically excluded groups for journal leadership positions. So this is just 4 of maybe 40 suggestions and checklists they have. So I would suggest taking a look at that toolkit, which is really interesting. Okay, we can go to the next one. The next one is an organization called the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications. And they have published what they're calling toolkits for equity. So these are really interesting as well. There's an anti-racism toolkit for organizations, a toolkit for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and a guideline on inclusive language and images in scholarly communication. So this is really varied in approach. Obviously, the toolkit for organizations is quite broad, and the guidelines are sort of in the weeds, very detail oriented, but also quite interesting and useful as well. And it's actually a good segue for our next topic, which is just to kind of touch on the issue of inclusive language in your journal publishing. And I'm sure this is something you've all thought of to some extent, perhaps just in passing. Some of you might have really be engaging with this in your journal publishing. If you're on the spectrum that's sort of not dug too deeply into it, I've listed quite a few good resources for further reading on this slide. And here we're really talking about, when we talk about inclusive language, it's really conscientiousness, or like an awareness of the way the language includes or excludes certain people. So some of the things we think about are avoiding ableist language, trying to use gender neutral language, using person first terminology. So instead of saying that somebody is a type 1 diabetic, you could say that they are a person with type 1 diabetes, so forth, effectively humanizing the person in front of the condition or the race or whatever element of their identity that you're discussing. Yeah, we can go on to the next slide, Katie. So, and this I've linked to what's a really interesting kind of quick read. It's an article, a blog post actually by Kristen Minter called A Case Study on Anti-Black Publishing Practices. And I'm just highlighting this for you to kind of point you to an example of an author's perspective of where and when language matters. So that in this case, Kristen had submitted an article to the Journal of the Medical Library Association, who had just put out kind of drafted and made public an equity statement. And his experience with that publishing process was that the language that he had intentionally chosen and used was rejected by the copy editor without sort of approval or further explanation. And when he tried to have a conversation about it, was sort of shot down and wasn't supported by the editors, and in the end sort of decided to publish elsewhere, and kind of came to the conclusion that the journal wasn't ready, despite their equity statement, that they actually weren't really ready to engage with some of the issues around language. So we can go to the next slide, Katie. So it's not meant to frighten you, but sort of just to give you an example of where and when you do kind of take on some of these issues or want to explore it or make it more equitable for your audience, that some of the things you might consider, some of the things you might face might require a bit more effort. So in this case, I would say if inclusive language is something that you think is really important for your journal, that you want to pursue, the thing I would say is that you can be really specific, and you probably have a lot of places where you engage with your authors, your reviewers, and your copy editors around language guidelines, right? So this is an example here on the screen of copy editing advice or guidelines, I guess, that I received as a copy editor on a journal around inclusive language. And as the copy editor, I found this to be a useful kind of directional guideline. It kind of reminded me that this is an issue to keep an eye open for this. They're kind of pointing out very broadly what to look out for without kind of going into too much specifics. And I'll just say it was a great starting point. And as I've been working for them and getting kind of getting into the work and understanding what I'm coming up against, I will say that it's definitely not comprehensive, and I'm not sure that it's supposed to be. But one of the things that I find is that one of the corrections I commonly make is capitalizing Indigenous when it's appropriate, and particularly with a lot of American authors that we deal with. And that's a discussion, a conversation that I'm really comfortable having with people. So I might flag it, they might skip over it, and then I would flag it again and sort of explain, because they might not have the background to know why I'm making that suggestion. That's not a really standard rule, and if they're in a different context, they may not know about it. That's something that I'm comfortable doing, but that comfort level is going to be subjective. So the point I'm making is the more specific you can be about your expectations, the better. And the other thing I would say is that preparing for this presentation, I kind of took a peek at the author style guidelines and realized the authors don't have anything in their submission guidelines, about inclusive language. So that sort of means the onus for catching this kind of problematic language falls on the copy editors, and it's not expressed as sort of an intention or an expectation of the authors. So that's just something to consider. This isn't meant to be a negative example. I think it's fine what they've done, and it's kind of just interesting to share what different journals are doing, and kind of, I think it could go deeper, but I also think what they've done was helpful for me as a copy editor. And then this is sort of in the same vein. Katie, you can pass on to the next point. Something that I'm seeing happening within the library world is some templates for citing Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. And this is typically, I don't know that any of the official kind of citational style guides have kind of come to the point of expressing this formally in their guides. This is sort of something that is happening in a grassroots level. So this particular template was drafted by Larissa McLeod at Northwest College Library, and the U of A has adopted it as well in our citation guide as a guideline. And essentially what it does is to differentiate Indigenous elders and Indigenous knowledges from the category of personal communication into which it doesn't quite fit, right? So it kind of distinguishes it and sort of legitimizes it in an academic context. So this is just something that I've come across as a librarian, and I've thought from the point of view of a copy editor that this could be kind of like an interesting thing to know about. And that's it for that slide. And so in conclusion, I want to say that I hope we haven't like overwhelmed you with the sensation that you have to do all of these things, because our intention is to kind of just start a discussion and start a point of thinking about this. So I know we're nearly at 1 o'clock. We've got a couple minutes left, but Katie and I can stay, answer any questions, and we're happy to hear from you. I'm going to pause the recording now. I'm going to stop it so that we can just have a discussion with whoever is willing to stay, and also